Reading with your kids.
Hola, ni hao, konnichiwa, assalamu alaikum, shalom, mahaba, moni muli wanji, namaste, jumbo, bienvenidos. Hi, my name is Jedley, and this is the Reading with Your Kids podcast. We're coming to you from the beautiful neighborhood of Reedville in the southwest corner of Boston, Massachusetts. We are so delighted and so honored that you're joining us in our mission to help all families grow closer through reading. Please be sure to tell all of your family and friends about the show, and please be sure to subscribe to the show on the iHeartRadio app, on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon Music, wherever you find your podcasts. Our guest today is Patrice Gopo. She is here to celebrate her beautiful picture book. It's called All the Places We Call Home. Before we invite Patrice into the studio, we want to let you know that this episode of the Reading with Your Kids podcast is brought to you by Why Should I Climb This Tree? A beautiful and inspiring picture book by Ryan Hogan. A young boy can't understand why climbing a tree would be any fun or why it would be a good use of his time. His dad, who's a veteran of climbing many trees, is determined to show his son why it matters so much. Urging children to go outside and play, the climbing tree is a metaphor for life. The boy discovers so much about his abilities and how connecting with nature can elicit feelings of confidence, positivity, and peace like nothing else can. Completing his journey to the top of the tree gives him perspective on his own life in the world and is the final reward. This book deserves to be in your family library. Why Should I Climb This Tree? By Ryan Hogan. This episode of the Reading with Your Kids podcast is also brought to you by Ancient Eats, an edible exploration of the world by Stephanie Hansen and put out by our friends at History Unboxed. Go on a mouth-watering journey through the ancient world with this family-friendly cookbook. Each of the more than 100 recipes is inspired by delicious historical dishes and adapted for ease of preparation in today's modern kitchen. Taste your way through 18 cultures as you feed your mind with mythical origins and the historical significance of food from around the world and from across tens of thousands of years. Our recipes are designed with families in mind. So many offer gluten-free, dairy-free, and vegetarian options. Each recipe has a recommended skill level for younger chefs. More than 100 photos will tempt your appetite and keep you flipping through this book of food history. Get your copy today. Ancient Eats, an edible exploration of the world by Stephanie Hansen and History Unboxed. And this episode of the podcast is also brought to you by Ken, by Carolyn Nonez Vasquez. This is a really, really powerful book. We meet Grace, who listens to a story told to her by her grandmother. Her grandmother shares her great wisdom, and at her grandmother's feet, Grace learns the lessons of nature and of the heart. And she learns that the greatest lesson of all is that we are all kin. Nature is much more than beauty to admire. Nature, animals, and plants teach children powerful lessons. Grace learns these lessons about life and friendship, and she discovers that learning to see all people and living creatures as kin is the only way we're going to heal our societies. Get your copy today. Really powerful book, Kin, by Carolyn Nonez Vasquez. Join us right now from the Charlotte area in the beautiful state of North Carolina. Our guest is here today to celebrate a brand new picture book. It's called All the Places We Call Home. Please welcome to the show, Patrice Gopo. Hey, Patrice, how are you?
Hey, I'm great. Thank you so much for having me on the show. It's super fun to be here.
I'm delighted to have you on. The title of your book, All the Places We Call Home, it reminds me, and we were talking a little bit about this beforehand, that there are actually lots of places that feel like home to us.
Yeah, absolutely. And that was really one of my intents with this book, All the Places We Call Home, was just this idea that children can be connected to more than just the place they fall asleep at night, that there are other places in the world that can be part of their story as well. And I wanted to encourage just that sense of recognizing that multiple places can be part of who we are. I think we often are trying to, like in our society, point to exactly where someone's home is. And we make it a very, I guess maybe a binary, that it's this or that. Mm-hmm. And I just think it doesn't have to be like that.
Yeah. I think I've shared this on the podcast before. My beautiful wife and I hosted international students in our home for a number of years from all over the world, China, Italy, and Netherlands. And one of the things that I used to do, first we would always pick them up at the airport, just to let them know how excited we were to have them in our home. And when we arrived back at our modest home, I would always say to them as we're getting out and getting their suitcases, I would point up above my home and I would say, hey, do you see the hotel sign above my roof? And they would always look at me like I have 5 heads, and they go, no. And I go, good, because this isn't a hotel. This is your home.
Oh,
and it was important for me because I wanted everybody who came into my home to feel like it is a home.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. I think that's lovely. And I think it really speaks to this idea that we connect with different places in different ways, that maybe we lived in a particular place for a season of our lives, and yet that place is still part of the story of us. And so I think it is a reality that these different places contribute to who we are, and that we often in our minds go back in time and think of that place as another home for us.
Yeah. I'm thinking back to all the places that I've lived in my life. And even though I've lived in our current home for over 25 years, I did a fair amount of bouncing around. And you take a little something away from every place you call home.
I think so. I think absolutely. And I think the other thing too that is part of this story. So in the story, what happens is this little girl, she spins a globe every night, and she then points to different places on the globe that are part of her story and her family's story. And then her mother tells stories of taking naps or sleeping in these different places. And they kind of go travel to these different places as the mom is recalling these memories. And one of the places this story is really based on the story of my family. That's where the idea came from. And one of the places that the little girl and her mother travel to through the memories and the storytelling is to Jamaica, which is actually a place where I am the child of Jamaican immigrants. And so while I have never lived in Jamaica, it is still part of my story. And that's another thing that I want to encourage children to recognize, is even places they've never lived that are tied to their story can be places that are part of what they think of as home.
Yeah. Was there one thing, I know this is based on your story and your family, but was there one incident that kind of sparked this idea that, I have to write this story?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll just back up a little bit and say, this is my debut picture book, but I actually started by writing essays for adults. So I have a collection of essays for adults that came out a couple of years called All the Colors We Will See. And one of the essays in that book, there is a moment where I am putting my daughter down for a nap on her great-grandmother's bed in rural Zimbabwe. And I remember a nap that I took on my grandmother's bed in rural Jamaica as a small child. And so that was actually the moment that started this story, is just that recognition of my own child experiencing something quite similar to something I had experienced as a child. And just that sense of these places being part of us, being important to us. So that was really the starting place for that essay. And after I wrote that essay, there was a point where I thought, I think this could also be the beginning of a picture book, a children's book. And so I then went in and looked about how I would change this to really focus in on the child audience. And so that moment of putting my daughter down for a nap on her great-grandmother's bed in rural Zimbabwe was really the start of the whole story.
Fascinating. What is it that makes a place, a home for you? Because I've slept in, I don't know, a couple of thousand Holiday Inn Expresses, in the past 30 years or so, but I don't consider any of them a home. Although I can see the layout of every room because it's the same. But
right.
What kind of ingredients, if you would, does a place need to become a home?
That's such a great question, Jed. And you know what? I think I'm going to think on my own answer for this, but I would just really encourage whoever is listening out there to also think about what that might be for them, because I don't think there's some hard and fast rule to what this is. But I do think we as human beings have a recognition of like connection to place. And I think when we feel that sense of connection to place, this is the beginning of when these places really start to feel like home. I think there can be a sense of, does this place hold part of my story? Does it hold part of who I am in it? And because of that place, my life is richer for it, I guess, is one way I might think about it. So I think those are some of the things that make me think of a place as being home. But again, I think this sometimes could be based more on feeling rather than necessarily like lists of items that we need to check off. I remember years ago, I went back to visit someplace I had lived for a couple years, and I remember having a sense of how the roads, like which direction to turn to get to a place I needed to go in that community. And I just thought, this place holds part of my story because I am recalling these details that while I don't use in my everyday life, they were very important to me at a certain point in time when I was living here. And so in a way, I think this place has contributed to the unique story of who I am. And so I think that's something to consider, is what are the places that contribute to the unique story of who you are? I know I grew up in Anchorage, Alaska. So my parents are Jamaican immigrants, but I grew up in Anchorage, Alaska. And while I don't live there anymore, that is a place I will always think of as being home. Even as I have added other places to being part of what I think of as home.
I am just imagining what your parents' reaction must have been when they got off the plane from after leaving sunny Caribbean Jamaica and arriving in Anchorage. No matter what time of year they arrived, it had to have been a big shock to the system.
I mean, it was a big difference, right? Yeah, a big difference. And I will say, it wasn't quite, well, for my mother, she did go right from Jamaica to Alaska. But my father, his journey was a little bit more circuitous, so it wasn't quite as pronounced. He had stopped in New York City for a couple of years, so he'd had some. But yes, I mean, I think sometimes there's such a stark contrast between these different places that might be part of us. And I think because there can be such this stark contrast, maybe in that way it can make it difficult at times to, I guess, capture the sense of all of this as being part of us. And I think one of the things that can really help with that is just acknowledging the large differences that exist, but also recognizing the ways you are connected to this place can be a thread that connects these places together.
Yeah. What was that? Now I'm imagining, and I'm just imagining because I have no idea. I was adding up the states I haven't been to yet, and Alaska is one of them.
Okay.
But, we have a large Jamaican population here in Boston, and I know one of the most wonderful memories my family and I had was traveling to Limon in Costa Rica, where there's also a large Jamaican population. I mean, the entire city, I think, is of Jamaican descent. But I'm guessing that there wasn't a large Jamaican community in Anchorage. What was it like growing up there?
No, there really wasn't. I mean, there were some Jamaicans that were there, certainly. And as you'll find people, because of movement and all of these things, you'll find people all over the place. But no, there really wasn't. So that was certainly a very interesting experience, growing up in Anchorage, growing up in Alaska, being this Black American daughter of Jamaican immigrants. And yet, for me, when I look back on my experience of growing up in Anchorage, I feel like yes, there were things that were complicated about that experience, and yet there were things that were just very wonderful. I feel like my parents found a very warm welcome when they went to Alaska. And I think for me, and I think this is a story for many people, though, is that there is a sense of trying to figure out identity and belonging. And so those were a lot of questions that, I was experiencing growing up there, because in our country, I am the Black American daughter of Jamaican immigrants, but my family story doesn't necessarily align as neatly with maybe the typical story that our country often offers for Black Americans. And so there was just this sense of like figuring out my own way. And so that I actually write about that a lot in my essay collection, All the Colors We Will See. But this picture book, All the Places We Call Home, while one of my hopes with this story was to create a more expansive conversation about the impact of place on people and how place contributes to who we are, and just creating more space. Because one thing that I think is really true, Jed, is I think within our country, we are often trying to narrow the categories that people can be part of. I think it can make it almost easier for our society to function if we can just look at someone and say, well, I know what category you're in, so that means I must kind of know who you are and know about your story. And my hope with this picture book is that I am inviting children and their families and caregivers to just recognize the vastness that exists within children, within all of us, and to celebrate the vastness that exists within all of us.
I think that's so important. And I think that families can have so many really rich and wonderful conversations as they're sitting down and reading All the Places We Call Home together. I'm just very simply sitting back as a dad and retelling stories to my kids about all the different places. I grew up in a neighborhood called Whiskey Point, and that place is legendary. And the stories that come out of there are some that we couldn't tell on a family podcast.
Right.
But my kids knew the different places I grew up in, and I think that's so. It's so important to have these opportunities to talk about ourselves and share our stories with our kids, and hopefully encouraging them to start thinking about their own stories and collecting those stories so that they can tell the people that are important to them.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Everything that you said there. And I think within the act of us doing this, within our families, within maybe classrooms, communities, however we're engaging with the sharing of these stories, I think it encourages our children to consider their own stories, but I think it also encourages our children to make space for the differing stories of others. As they listen to other people share their stories, they are recognizing the vastness that exists within another person too. And so I think that's also a really important, just quality that I would want to encourage within children and within all of us. So that's, a lot of what I'm hoping is happening in the world. And it is. I mean, people have written me notes about this book already, and it's really exciting to see. Someone wrote me a note about how after sharing this book with their grandchildren, they had this, wonderful, just like dinner conversation as people were engaging, the children were engaging, all of that. And I think those are the kinds of things that I think are really exciting in our world.
Well, I'm excited that there are still families sitting down and having those conversations at dinner time. It seems
absolutely.
We're so busy. We're running from here and there that we don't always take the time. And it was also something that was very important with our family is to sit down, and it's like, okay, it might just be 15 or 20 minutes, but we're all getting together. We're all going to sit down and eat, and we're going to talk.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And I think it's wonderful if it can happen around a table. That's great. But to your point too, I think there's plenty of other spaces in which these conversations can happen as well, however it fits into, people's lives and stuff. But I think the reality is just us making space for this vastness that exists within human beings, within children, within all of us, that we make space to recognize that, and we make space to help our children recognize that within other people as well.
You've used that phrase, the vastness that exists in all of us. And you were talking earlier about how we like to look at others and kind of put labels on them very quickly. one of the things that really concerns me is, it's always concerned me that we would try to put labels on others. But it seems like recently there's been this push for people to put labels on themselves. And I think that we're not only aren't we recognizing the vastness in others, I don't think that we're recognizing the vastness in ourselves. I think a lot of folks are like, okay, I think this way, I'm on team whatever color it is,
right.
And so I need to think in this way, and not being open to exploring that I agree with them 80% of the time, but I agree with these other folks 10 or 20%, and that's okay.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. No, you know what this makes me think as well is, I think one of the characteristics of being human is this desire for belonging. And I think if we as a society create these categories and we continue to just like narrow categories, and I just want to pause for a moment here and say, I do think there is space for the ways in which categories or labels may exist. I think sometimes we can be in a society where we almost like minimize certain characteristics or qualities about people. And so to assert a certain characteristic or quality is to say this is also important too. So I want to say that as well. But I also think that sometimes when we create these narrow categories and we then want to immediately put people in these places, we also create this idea that in order to belong, you must tick these certain boxes. And if you don't, then you can't really belong here. And if one of the characteristics of being human is this desire to belong, I think that's what can happen when we don't like recognize the expansiveness that can exist within a person. And so I think for my own self, when I think about all the places we call home, and so in this story, this little girl, she hears a story about where she was born in South Africa and, taking this, sleeping in her crib in South Africa. And then she hears this story about taking a nap on her great grandmother's bed in rural Zimbabwe. And then she hears this story about her mother taking a nap on her mother's grandmother's bed in rural Jamaica. And so these are these stories that are there. And I just think it's such what would you say, like just a gentle way of saying we can embrace all these parts of who we are. Mm-hmm. We can embrace all these parts of who we are. And however it is that a child chooses to identify and categorize themselves and whatever, that can still be their full story, can fit within that.
Yeah. How was the experience writing for kids after writing for adults for so long?
Oh, yeah, that's a great question. And it was really interesting, Jed, to move from, I wouldn't say move from, because I still write for adults as well, but to add writing for children into what it is that I write, because for me, it was a big learning process to start with. So when I started writing for adults, I engaged with a lot of, reading craft books and taking classes and studying personal essays as I was learning the craft and writing personal essays. And so when I started writing picture books, there was also this time of learning that I needed to engage with, because while I am a writer, I didn't really understand how picture books were their own unique form. And so there was just additionally just this time that I needed to take to learn the craft. And so as I was doing that, I started to recognize, like, how do I make this story engaging for a child? And what is it that a child might be looking for from the story? So for me, I find that it really just gave me a different perspective on my writing, which I think is wonderful for writers, for us to do at any point, to just gain some fresh perspective on our writing. So that was really the process. I will say, I'll just be super honest with everyone here. My first couple drafts of this manuscript fell far short of where they needed to be, because I was still so focused on that kind of essay mindset that I brought to the writing. And I needed to really shed some of that and make space for a different kind of mindset to emerge as I was thinking about picture books.
Yeah. I imagine one of the challenges was, how do I say something I usually say in 10, 15, 20,000 words in 600 words?
Right. It's true. It's true. Now, I will say one of the benefits that I mentioned earlier, that this picture book, All the Places We Call Home, it is based on an essay in my essay collection. And that essay was only about 800 words long. So the story itself was already fairly compressed, but there were just different things that I needed to do. How did I change this story to be from the child perspective? And really, as I was writing the original essay, it was very image focused. It was focused very much on the image, and the story emerged from the images there. But as I was turning this into a picture book, I realized what I really needed was the story to be in place, and then to bring the imagery to the story. So that was a little bit of a flip for me.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I think this would be just a lovely book and a really fun book. I'm imagining that it's a book that families could read over and over again without thinking, oh, I have to read this book again, because you could take just one memory. When you read, oh, I lived in this place. And I also, when I was 10, I lived in this other place. And just having those stories, and even talking to your kids and asking them, where do you think you would like to call one of your homes?
Yeah. Yes, absolutely. And I'll just encourage listeners out there, for a fun activity would be to take a globe or a map of the world. Actually, you can see my globe. I know listeners are not going to be able to see my globe, but this globe behind me, I take it to school visits. And after I share the story, I invite children to come up and take a little sticker dot and stick it on any place that matters to them, that matters to their story. So, they can use as many stickers as they want. I also have a map of the United States. So, just different maps, globes, whatever, and just stick it on the places that feel important. So I think that could be a wonderful activity that people could do with children. I also will just say, if people are really interested in engaging more with this, if you go to my website, patricegopo.com, I have a gift there for anyone who subscribes to my newsletter, and part of that gift is you receive an activity. It's a poem activity called A Place I Call Home. And it's an activity that leads children to write a poem about a place that they think of as home.
Wow. But talk about efficient. I typically ask the last question. I ask, where can we go to find out more? You've already told us.
All right. Yeah.
PatriceGopo.com.
Yes, that's right.
And I just want to encourage everybody to check out the website, check out the book. I think it would be a lot of fun for families. The name of the book, again, is All the Places We Call Home, and we've been speaking with the author, Patrice Gopo. Hey, Patrice, thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much. It's been a real pleasure being with you today.
Please be sure to join us for the next episode of the Reading with Your Kids podcast. Our grace will be Becky Garish. She'll be here to celebrate Escape to Play. This is a really unique and beautiful picture book. Becky is the author and illustrator. Her picture book, it contains fabulous illustrations about the story. But in each one of the spreads, there's also a classic piece of art. There's so much going on in this book, and there's so much going on in our conversation. You don't want to miss it. And you don't want to miss a minute of what's happening on the Reading with Your Kids podcast. So please connect with us on social media, facebook.com/readingwithyourkids, at Reading With Your Kids on Instagram, at Reading With Your Kids on TikTok, and it's at Jedley Magic on Twitter. Also, please be sure to visit our website, readingwithyourkids.com. Click on the contact button at the top of the page to send us a message, and also sign up for our free online magazine. I want to thank the folks who made today's show so wonderful. Of course, I want to start by thanking our guest, Patrice Gopo. Please be sure to check out All the Places We Call Home. Also want to thank our sponsors, Why Should I Climb This Tree? By Ryan Hogan, Ken by Carolyn Nunez Vasquez, and Ancient Eats by Stephanie Hansen. I want to thank my team, Fatima Khan, Rory Grady, Mirabella Q, Jordan Saley. I want to thank my beautiful wife for all the support she gives me. Most of all, we all want to thank you. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us today. And as always, thank you so very much for taking the time to make the world a better place by reading with your kids. I'll be looking for you in the next edition of the Reading with Your Kids podcast.